this video, we'll be looking at creating a workflow inside Resolve Actions Express. I have the Workflow Designer here on my screen, prompting me to create a new workflow. The example we're going to look at today is quite simple, just to get people started. This will serve as a user lookup automation that will take input on a specific Active Directory user, retrieve some properties from the domain, and return them back to the requester. I'll choose to store this in my development and testing folder. For the description, we'll say this is just for example purposes, and since it deals with Active Directory, we'll give it a tag of Active Directory as well. We'll go ahead and click Create, and we are now presented with an empty canvas. All right, let's get started. For those who haven't seen the Workflow Designer overview video, it's highly suggested that you watch that before this video, just so you can get an idea of how the designer is configured and how to navigate your way around it. Now, our first step here is to determine what activities will be involved in our process. As we've learned, we can go to the menu on the left to navigate through a huge collection of pre-built integrations and activities. And as I said, we will be using Active Directory today. So just to start our development, how about we go to the Active Directory Accounts group, and we will use Get Property. Now, one important thing to note is that you become more comfortable over time with the Workflow Designer, and you start to actually remember the names of these activities, and rather than needing to find them, drag them, and drop them onto the canvas, you can at any point click the plus sign, and for example, start typing, and the autocomplete will take care of the rest. I'll go ahead and get rid of that, and now let's open up our settings. So just to start our development and testing, let's look up information on John Smith. Now we are going to want to point at our domain controller, a device profile I already have configured and saved here, and we are also going to want to provide credentials. Now it's important to note that we can store things like service account credentials directly in the device profile like we see here. We can also store them in global variables. And you'll see with the autocomplete window, if I head to the Global tab, Windows Account User and Windows Account Pass are two global variables that I'm using to store my service account credentials. We can also retrieve these credentials in real time from something like a key vault or password store. So first and foremost, for the property dropdown, I will test this by retrieving the display name for this user. And I'll give this activity a custom name. How about user full name? Now, as we learned in the workflow overview video, each and every activity will produce some type of output. And in this case, the output will be the display name for this user. And now, this custom name I've given here will serve as a variable where we can reference that data anywhere downstream in the workflow. Now that I've saved it, I'll click the play button in the top right to execute this workflow and assess the output in the audit trail below. And there we see the full display name coming from the domain, John Smith. Okay, great. Now what other properties might we want to retrieve on this user? Well, for today's example, I'll choose something like, how about job title, and the city and state where they live, as well as their email address. So I could bring the AD get property activity into the workflow several more times and reconfigure it, but more conveniently, I can click on the hamburger icon to the left, click copy, click our plus sign, and then click paste. And I can do this as many times as I need it. So let's say we need the full name, we've got that already, the title, the city, the state, and the email. So that will be 4 more get property activities. 3 and 4. All right. So looking at the second one, we don't need display name anymore. We need the job title. And we will save this as user title. Next, let's go for the city. And of course, we get the convenient autocomplete there. We'll save this as user city. I mentioned we will want to retrieve the state or province in which they live. We'll call this user state, and as you can see, all of the other information is already populated here. And then lastly, we will go for their email address. So we'll select email, user email. I'll save this little workflow snippet here, run it, and let's see what kind of output we get. Well, there's John Smith for the full name. Our title, Senior Marketing Graphic Designer. Location, sunny Boca Raton, Florida, and of course, their email address. I'll go ahead and collapse the execution log below so we have a little more screen real estate to work with. All right. Now that we've got the basics down of the properties we will retrieve for this user, which currently is hard-coded to John Smith, it's time to start thinking about how this small workflow will function in a production or reality-type setting. Now, in today's example, we are going to be leveraging the built-in self-service portal inside of Resolve Actions Express, a place where users can submit forms, automated workflows can run in the background, and then display back to them results. In a later video, we will dive into some more complex examples, like triggering workflows from external events, such as tickets and alerts, how to configure things like trigger conditions, and a whole lot more. Okay, so back to our example workflow here. Now we do know that this form we will be creating will at least provide one input field, the username, right? Well, I've currently got the user hard-coded here to John Smith. Let's decide that the user input field we will name lookup user. So we can see from the variable autocomplete it didn't find anything, and it shouldn't. This variable does not yet exist in the context of this workflow, but it will. So I'll go ahead, copy that variable name, save it there, save it here, and of course, save it here. All right, great. So of course, if we were to run this now, we would get nothing but 5 individual errors because, well, there is no lookup user variable, and there is no user under that name, of course, for which to retrieve properties. But to simulate this, I could do something like this with set memory, store a variable without the percent symbols, of course, and give it that value, John Smith, save it to the scope of workflow. I'll expand the execution log, and when I run this again, we can see the variable was stored as the first step, and now it will perform the rest of the lookups all successfully. Alternatively, if we delete this activity and use the set variables feature up here, we can remove Windows account user and pass, as we know those are coming from global variables, and we can say that this lookup user for incoming variables is something that we want to populate. So this is a great feature that lets us test out workflows that are not yet put into full production. So I'll click Save here for lookup user to be a required input variable. Let me expand that execution log window below, and this time when I click play, it is going to prompt me to fill this variable in. So this is more closely simulating the self-service portal experience we are going to create shortly. And when I run this, all of the same expected output is produced below. The full name, job title, etc. Okay, now that we've come this far, we need to start thinking about things like error handling. So logic that takes into account human error, or just computational error. In this case, something like a user that doesn't exist. So I'll go ahead and collapse the execution log, and let's bring an if-else branch to the top of the workflow. And what we're going to want to assess here is whether or not a user exists. So we'll go to the Active Directory category, and under Accounts, we will look for AD user exists. I'll give this a custom name here. User exists. We know lookup user is our input variable. We will point it at our domain controller. We will fill in the service account user and the service account password variables. Save that. And now we will be able to continue with the development of this workflow. So as mentioned before, and as you've already seen, every activity inside of the platform produces some type of output. Sometimes it's something like a true or a false, success, failure. Sometimes it's to return a string of data, like we saw with these Active Directory get property activities. Or sometimes it's used to return multi-dimensional table data. In the case of AD user exists, if we navigate to the Help tab, we can see that it provides us with a true or false output. So our first check here is to ensure the user is valid and does exist in the domain. And if we configure our if-else branch here on the left, we can say predefined true. Now, the default behavior for these if-else branches is to evaluate the output of the activity just above it. It's important to note, though, and something we will dive into in a future video, you can also create your own formulas or assess output in a more numeric way. If we were doing this with a formula, we could say user exists equals true. And of course, we can get a lot more complex than that. But as I said, we will select predefined true and save. Now, if the user exists, we would like all of these actions here to be executed. So we could, of course, drag them and drop them one by one like this, or we can use the hamburger icon, click select, group all 4 of these, cut them, and then paste them. A lot more convenient. All right, now that we've done that, how about we expand our execution log window at the bottom and go ahead and test out our new design changes. So John Smith will still be our lookup user. Let's go ahead and run. Well, we can see the first execution of the AD user exists activity returned true, and therefore the left branch was traveled and the rest of the output is provided as expected. Now what happens if we say john.smith1, a user that we know doesn't exist? We'll run this again, and after the AD user exists activity executes, returns false, the workflow terminates because there is, of course, nothing on this right branch yet. So, as I said, this workflow will be put behind a self-service portal page that will allow end users to perform this lookup. So, what we want to do is start putting together a message that will get returned to the user. To do this, we'll use a couple of set memory activities. One here on the right will be used for when the user does not exist and we have to return an error message. We'll name this set response message failure. We'll call the variable response message. And the message we want to return, how about we write something like the specified user, lookup user, does not exist. Please try again. We'll go ahead and save that. Now it's time to create the success message. Like the little trick from earlier, save us a moment here by just doing a simple copy and paste. And if we open up the settings, we can name this set response message success. The variable name, of course, is the same, but our message will be different. How about below are the details of the requested user? Name. And as we can see, we're getting auto populations. So we have user full name, nice and easy. Title, user title. We'll have location, user city, comma, user state, and lastly, the email address. We'll go ahead and save this, open up our execution log, and test once again. I'll click our play button, and this time I'll be sure to correct the username to a valid one. Go ahead and run the workflow. We can see that everything was successful. The memory set at the very bottom left was executed, and in the remark column, if we click to expand the details, we can actually see the exact message that we are constructing to send back to the user. Full name, title, location, and email address. So, is that all we need? One last step. I'll collapse that window, and now we are going to add a self-service response message. So I could find this on the left-hand menu, but as I said, let's use our little shortcut here. Start typing in self-service. We'll use self-service response. We'll give it a name. Respond to request. And the response itself will be the response message variable that we constructed right over here. So no matter which path the workflow travels, we only need one self-service response activity at the end, and it will send the contents of that variable. Okay, we are ready to save. And move on to the SelfService Designer. To do that, I'll open up our main menu in the top left here, and under Builder, select SelfService Designer. Alright, let's go ahead and create a form. We'll call it AD User Lookup, just like the workflow, but of course we could use any name that we'd like. And for the folder, we'll put it in the Development and Testing subfolder under Self-Service Demos. Description, self-service page to look up data on an AD user. Sure, that'll work. And we'll assign the Active Directory tag and create our form. And now we're presented with another blank canvas, but this time for a self-service page. So first and foremost, I'm going to link this form to an existing workflow. I'll use the autocomplete here, AD user lookup, the one we just developed together. I'll make sure that this page is enabled. And let's start with some data. So how about a label here? We'll give this some style. AD user lookup page. Please enter the username to lookup. Nice and easy. We'll make the heading here a bit bigger and click Save. Next, we want to drag a text type field over, as this will serve as an input field for the user submitting the form. We'll give it a label, username, and as you can see, because we already linked to our AD user lookup workflow to the top left here, all of the non-defined variables are automatically available from the dropdown. And like I said before, these are global variables, so they don't exist in the scope of the workflow, but of course we're not going to be working with those. Lookup user is going to be our input field. So I'll go ahead and save, and then save our form. We can also see that at that time we're allowed to delegate out permissions here, so we'll just assign this to one of our users and save. Okay, now it's time to test this out. We'll go back to the menu, and from the home page section, open up the self-service portal. Now from the folders on the left, I will find my AD user lookup form that we just created together. So we can see the basic descriptions at the top, as well as all of the text, labels, and fields that we defined. So we will submit a valid form first for the user John Smith. And there we have it. All of the output from our workflow is present right here on the self-service portal response page. The employee name, or the username rather, their title, location, and email address. Let's try it again with an invalid username. How about we type Robert.Dale. We'll submit our form again, and this time we are given the message that the specified user does not exist. Please try again, just as expected. And back over to the Workflow Designer. This is the simple workflow that we built, but it helps exemplify some of the key design components of the platform, things like generating data, variables, passing them downstream, things like if-else branches, as well as how to take input from external places, process it, and produce some type of output. And of course, the external place in this case was Resolve's own built-in self-service portal, the same place to which we posted the results. But like I said, tune into future videos where we are going to look at more complex use cases where data from things like tickets and alerts is used to trigger a workflow and actually get to work on things like self-healing, automatic remediation, as well as automated request fulfillment. Well, that's it for the video. Thank you everybody for watching.